Good morning, and first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here. I think it's a great opportunity to talk about some things that we're doing at Geisinger. Let me give you a little introduction to myself first. My name's Nick Marko. I'm a physician at Geisinger Health System. So about half of my time is spent in my clinical practice. I'm a neurosurgeon with a focus in neurosurgical oncology. So I see patients, I operate on brain and spine tumors, and I still very much am active in the clinical space. The other half of my life is as Geisinger's Chief Data Officer. So Geisinger Health System is a system in central Pennsylvania. It kind of covers most of Pennsylvania that's not the Philadelphia area or the Pittsburgh area. So it's all that stuff that you may have driven through in the middle of Pennsylvania that you're like, my God, what is this? It turns out there's actually a lot of people there. They're just spread out all over the place. So our system has, I think, 80-some primary care centers, 6 or 7 main hospitals, covers an area of about 3.5 million people or so. We're an integrated provider payer network. We've got a health plan associated with us that covers a decent number of the patients in that area. So that's where we're coming from. Geisinger has been interested in information and data for a long time. We were, I think, the second or third major client of Epic Systems. We've had our EHR in place since the mid-90s. So we've got 20-some odd years worth of clinical data from the EHR, and then lots of data from other places as things have grown up. And so, using that information to do something valuable has always been a part of our culture. Sometimes we've been good at it, sometimes we've had challenges with it, but it's always been a learning experience for us. And so I wanted to talk about some things that are sort of new on our radar right now, and essentially let you know how we're thinking about things. So let's see, is this thing? I guess I got to turn it on. That usually helps. Perfect. The mandatory academic disclosure slide. If you Google me, you may see that I do some independent consulting around this kind of thing and whatever. None of that is relevant here. I'm here as a representative of Geisinger. I do only have one Twitter handle, though, because I would hate to break Twitter by trying to make all of my many, many followers have 2 accounts that they have to follow. Just it'd be terrible if all those people had to do that twice. So if you want to tweet about anything, that's the one to use. So I think, the title of the talk is Get Out of the EHR and Innovate. And so I think it's important to talk about a few things first, specifically what the talk is not. So the first thing is it's not designed to be a primer on innovation. You can go onto YouTube or log into any TED site and find world famous innovators telling you why it's important to be innovative and how to do that and that sort of thing. So you certainly don't need to hear that from me again. The second thing is when I give talks like this, when I try to put these together for audiences like this, I try to avoid doing the here's a gallery of our accomplishments kind of thing. Here's this project, here's that project, here's a bunch of graphs and charts that show how this thing trended up or down or whatever. Not that those are bad. In fact, those are very instructive. I just find that sometimes, it's always a mixed audience. People come from different healthcare systems, different places in the spectrum. What's applicable at our organization may or may not be specifically applicable. And when I listen to one of those talks from somewhere else, I usually go, well, that's really cool that they're doing that stuff. What does that really mean to me? And so it's sort of a mixed bag. So I try to avoid that. Therefore, you will see absolutely no actual data in this presentation, no charts, no graphs, nothing to have to stare at numerically at 8 o'clock in the morning. That was the other consideration, because 8 o'clock is too early for graphs and charts. So instead, I try to focus on concepts. I think what's perhaps most interesting to people and what's most interesting to me when I'm in the audience is how are places that do things related to whatever we're doing or talking about, how are they thinking about this? What's on their radar right now? What are some general strategies that have been working or that haven't been working? Where's the thought? What direction is the thought going? This kind of thing. And so that's what I try to do with this talk, is to keep it conceptual and just sort of give you some insight about what we're thinking about and see hopefully what other people are thinking about in this space too. The other thing I want to point out is that this is not a criticism of electronic medical records, even though the title is Get Out of the EHR and Innovate. So I think electronic medical records are very good tools that are very robust and do what they do well. And what they do is largely replace a paper-based chart system with an electronic system that aggregates information, that presents it in a very usable way for clinicians and people who are providing patient care or doing billing activities or whatever. They're fundamentally a transactional system, right? And they do a very good job of that. The challenge comes in when we start to try to make a fundamentally transactional system into something that it was really never intended to be, and that is a robust environment for data exploration, data mining, information discovery, R&D on data-related products, that sort of thing. So I think when you say it in that context, and when you think about it like that sort of logically, you go, well, that makes sense. An EHR may not be the ideal environment to do that kind of stuff. Why is a talk like this even necessary? I buy your premise on principle. Well, I would say that it's not self-evident because number one, when I look around and talk to folks at organizations, and even look at my own organization, plenty of people are trying to do a lot of their agile R&D work inside an EHR environment and are often very frustrated by that, spend a lot of time and resources on that, and it's just a fundamentally, I think, a losing proposition. And so our thought process is shifting toward getting out of the EHR for those activities and essentially having a whole different way to look at our secondary use of data. And so I want to present some of the reasons, first of all, why we think that's an important thing to do, and hopefully make it more than just a general concept, and demonstrate why I think that it's actually a reasonable approach to things. So that's going to be the first part of the talk, really. I've divided it into two sections. The first part is, why is it really important to get out of the EHR, and why is it a suboptimal environment for doing these kind of things? And then the second part of the talk is some thoughts about how one might actually go about doing that, at least in some sort of structural context, to say, okay, if you buy the premise that there's a better place than inside an EHR to do these things, then how do we go about creating a place like that, or what might be some general ground rules for making that kind of environment? And in that part, I'll go through some of the general ideas that we have about how we're doing that at Geisinger. But again, not a criticism of EMRs as a transactional system, just saying that they're good for what they were intended for, and when you try to use them for something they weren't intended for, that's where you get into problems. So that being said, let's knock the EHR a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. So this is part one. So why do we really need to get out of the EHR when we're talking about fundamentally important tasks in data-driven innovation? So to talk about this, let's think about what data-driven innovation really is and what kind of a space it needs to make things happen. So first of all, we know some things about innovations, and then this is going to be the context that I present this in. Number one is that innovation tends to start small. So that's Alexander Fleming's penicillin jar that that he used to culture and produce penicillin. This story is probably very familiar to this audience, being a clinical group, but penicillin was discovered serendipitously, or so the story goes, by seeing a clearing of bacteria around some mold that had made it into Fleming's lab. But really, the point of this is you can't start much smaller than Fleming started with penicillin. The pioneering discovery probably would not have been made if he were working in the context of a large-scale pharmaceutical company where the emphasis was on scale and rapid production and that sort of thing. He was in a context where something completely different could happen, where some outside-the-box thinking could happen, and it really wasn't a scale-oriented operation. In fact, interestingly, when the Nobel Prize was awarded for the production of penicillin, Fleming shared it with some folks from Merck and from some other labs that he worked with that then brought the discovery to scale. So it was 1910, 1912 when penicillin was invented. It was 1944-ish when we could actually produce it with any sort of consistency and in large quantity, and so that whole process was the Nobel Prize winning award. And we can thank World War II and the need to treat venereal disease for the mass production of penicillin. But the point is that huge scale innovation that saved lots of lives started very small. In fact, the first batch of clinically used penicillin was really only enough to treat 2 patients. So we've come a long way, but it was an entirely different context. EMRs aren't small, by the way. So I don't know if anybody has ever tried to do something small scale inside an EMR, or a little bit of development work or something like this. There's just nothing small about the system. It runs on big servers. It functions off of huge databases. It takes a whole team of people to do things, and often the governance model and the implementation models around EHR are very large, right? So you may have a very good system for pushing, cyclical developments and upgrades through your EHR, but try to push some small idea or some little project through that, and just the whole thing from start to finish is not really engineered for somebody doing small pioneering kind of work. So related to that, we also know that innovation is agile. So anybody know what this is a picture of, by the way? All right, not quite as familiar as the penicillin story. That's good. So this is the Lockheed XP-80, the first jet-powered fighter produced by Americans anyway. So the story of the XP-80 was that in 1943, the U.S. government started to get scared because we got intel that the Germans were actually testing their first jet-powered fighters and had working prototypes, and we were at risk of losing air superiority if that actually came to fruition. So the Brits had designed a jet engine already. The de Havilland Company produced 2 of them and sent one of them to America for work. By the way, that's the same company that would later design the Dash 8 plane that brought me here to Boston and is the great turboprop with no overhead space that everybody flies in regionally, if you've ever had that pleasant American airline experience. But at any rate, so the XP-80 was designed by Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. It was their first project. Kelly Johnson was the engineer tasked with putting that together and said, we will go from paper to flying prototype in 180 days. That was the task. Actually delivered the project in 143 days to wheels up from the runway with a team of about 30 engineers or so, and then a variety of production people. So think about how difficult it must have been to produce an entirely new plane from nothing but a jet engine in a company like Lockheed that was already huge and producing, mass producing airplanes for the war effort, and saying we're going to design you an entirely new plane in 180 days. One of the first things that they did essentially when Skunk Works was created was throw out most of the rules and processes that governed creating things in the Lockheed system, and Johnson wrote down about 15 new rules that were the ground rules for how they were supposed to do this rapid cycle R&D. And interestingly, those set of ground rules grew up to become some of the foundational principles of the agile strategies that people use now and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying that you have to specifically use an agile strategy, but the idea is when you're trying to innovate, you've got to be able to sidestep or get rid of some of the rules that work at scale and that are designed to make your production environments or your production systems be robust to a variety of problems. And EHRs are just fundamentally not that. They're monolithic. They are not agile. Programming even small changes into them takes a lot of work. Much of the code is proprietary or is known only by a small group of people that you work with. These people tend to be disproportionately expensive and hard to find and are often not the most creative individuals because their focus and training has always been on production line work for EHRs. So trying to create an agile environment inside an EHR, at least for us, is not a terribly winning proposition, and it certainly wouldn't get a jet fighter off the ground in 143 days. So the next thing that ties closely to that is that innovation tends to be iterative. So you've got to try something and then try a slightly different version of it and then try a slightly different version of it again and again and again. So most people have probably seen Dyson on TV talking about how he had a passion for vacuum cleaners and 5,000 prototypes later came up with one that didn't lose suction, right? It actually is a pretty cool story of innovation, and it took him about 10 or 15 years to really do that iterative process, but it really was a over and over and over, build it, adjust it a little bit, build it, adjust it a little bit kind of process. And it came up with the vacuum cleaner that my wife loves more than any other household appliance except possibly the Vitamix blender, which was a real win last Valentine's Day, I might add. So I've got a good track record of these kind of things, right? So at any rate, Adrian's giving me a dirty look. I'm telling you, the Dyson vacuum cleaner. So at any rate, it's an iterative process, right? And EMRs aren't good at iterating, so they're usually on twice-a-year upgrade cycles or something like this. And if you try to come in the middle and deploy something small and then see how it works and then adjust it and deploy it again and again and again, that violates the operational principles of the whole thing. I mean, just trying to push an update to a standard EMR is a multi-week, multi-month process, and that's not a great environment for iterative type R&D work. That often goes hand in hand with the idea that innovation fails. Any idea what this is? So that's one of the many crashes of a SpaceX rocket. They haven't had the greatest time lately, but every time they put one up, it gets a little bit closer to being able to commercialize space flight. This one made it all the way up, and the picture just shows some problems that it had coming down. But at any rate, that's continuing to improve. And that's the point. When you're doing something innovative, you're going to break it a bunch of times, and that's okay. And you have to have an environment that tolerates things breaking a bunch of times. EMRs are designed for the primary function of being stable. You do not want your EMR to break ever. You don't want to have to worry about even one dropped appointment or one missed note or something like this. And so the design priority from the very beginning and from the ground up has always been to make a structure that's incredibly stable, that's highly redundant, and that never breaks. And that's perfectly fine and reasonable for a transactional system, but most of what we do on the R&D side is figuring out new and exciting ways to break things, and EMRs are just not a good environment for doing that. So that then feeds into this one, which I think is critically important. It's that innovation sees new patterns in things, and EMRs are basically designed to show you existing patterns in things. What does that mean? Well, if you think about the Napster trend, so this happened right about the time that I was an undergraduate, and the whole idea of digital downloading and digital content delivery was something that was popping up largely on college campuses and other places around the time. So I'm familiar with that story and lived through the beginning of this part of the digital download revolution, right? So why didn't Sony Music or one of the other large groups get the idea that we should be delivering our content digitally? Because now they pretty much all are, right? They've come around to this. But why were they not only violently opposed to it at the beginning, but it wasn't really anywhere on their radar, and this was kind of like an underground movement of people essentially illegally sharing copyrighted files? Well, it's because what they were largely focused on was the world they had created within the thought model or the paradigm of music delivery, right? It was all about, like, how can you make a better CD? Who's going to do the cover art? Which exciting new band can you sign? How big is the tour going to be? What do the numbers look like? So it was fundamentally constrained to the system that had always worked, and so nobody was seeing a new pattern. The new pattern emerging was that everybody now, particularly the big client base for music, had a computer, had a reasonably fast internet connection, was starting to lug their laptops around with them. I mean, I downloaded my first, my first songs on Napster or a Napster-like client using a highly mobile dial-up modem that was about this big, but could be conveniently smacked on the back of your laptop, and you could walk around with it, and it used a cellular signal to help you download at like 56K or whatever it was at that point, right? But everybody was actually getting more mobile, and if you aren't constrained to the system that looks at music delivery as the way you always have, you start to see that there's a new pattern emerging that's not in the space that you're looking at, and then you can put the two together. EHRs do not inherently favor looking at data in new and interesting ways. So you have to build a very standard view of some kind. When you get it, it tends to be a very static type thing. When you're looking at it, it will tell you exactly what you want to see, but if there's some novel trend, it's not really the best way to highlight that. So you tend to not see what you're not looking for, and that's a really important part of facilitating innovation. And then the last one is that innovation really catalyzes cultural change. So certainly there's been cultural change around EMRs because we went from a paper-based system to a paperless system, and that's a cultural change. But I think you have to think bigger scale when you're really talking about an innovative product that's going to change the way that we deliver healthcare or something like this. So, the picture on the back here is the oral contraceptive pill, which was considered a generator of cultural revolution, not only because it provided a new service that people didn't have before, but when it was designed and came to market in the 50s or something like this, it was first of all illegal to sell anything or advertise anything that interfered with reproductive abilities of women. It was marketed sort of as a hormonal modulator, and then only secondarily in I think the early 60s did the FDA finally decide to approve it as a modulator of pregnancy. But the point is, it wasn't just that it was a pill that did something medically. surprisingly, because it had been developed like that and because it had a real social context that it went into, I mean, it changed everything from standard of living, because people could now engage in family planning. It could be distributed to, all over the globe, really, because it wasn't terribly expensive to produce. It may or may not have helped usher in the sexual revolution of the 60s. But at any rate, the point is, there was a whole cultural context around this innovation that was being driven by people wanting to take this into a lot of different spaces, and as a result, it touched a lot of areas. EMRs just don't touch that many areas. I mean, you sit there and you work with them transactionally, but then you put it down and you go away and you do something else. That's not going to follow you around, and it's not going to really be a vehicle or a platform for broad-based cultural change. And that's really part of what true innovation, rather than just incremental improvement, is. And so it's an inherently constraining context, because whatever you do is only going to work in the context in which you employ that EMR. And so I think you have to think broader scale than that. So I put this picture up because despite all of these things, you will find that many people are still trying to do a lot of their data-driven innovation in the EMR. And you will find that many EMR vendors are trying to say, well, we can do that too. We can layer a big data product on top of what we're doing, or we can put, a special relational database that you can mine data out of. And I mean, they sort of work, right? But really, you're taking a fundamentally transactional system and trying to put some other stuff on it to make it do something that it was never really intended for. And not surprisingly, while it may look rather similar to what you're trying to approximate, it doesn't actually perform in exactly the same fashion. And the good news is, though, there are things that are designed to do what this is designed to approximate, and you can actually get to them and use them, and you don't have to go with something like this. But this is kind of how I conceptualize a lot of these new data-related things that are being thrown on top of EMRs by vendors and that sort of thing. So be cautious. So those are some basic reasons why I think the EMR is just not a good place to do your data-driven innovation. It's fundamentally a constraining environment. So that being said, what might a system look like where you can actually do the things that you want to do? And how are we at Geisinger, for instance, trying to create a system like this, or to implement this, not just on the technology side, but across the entire culture? So let's go through this one step at a time. So the first thing that you have to think about if you're going to do some sort of data-driven innovation is the data itself, right? And you've got to get that in a good place for actually being able to do something with it. Now, this may be the EMR, by the way, but we hear about this all the time, the idea of EMR based interoperability. How can we get data from different places and from different systems and whatever into an electronic medical record? Certainly we've spent lots of hours and many billions of dollars working on this, and it is entirely possible that if we continue that, some combination of the commercial sector and the government may find a solution to this problem on a large scale for many billions of dollars. It is also possible that I may win the Powerball in the near future. It is similarly possible that the lovely and talented Taylor Swift may decide that what she's been missing from her life is a 37-year-old neurosurgeon with a slightly receding hairline, and that these things need to change immediately. And while all of these things are possible, because I did buy a Powerball ticket, and Taylor Swift is from central Pennsylvania, might I point out, I am not exactly banking my future plans on any of these things coming to fruition. So what that means is that, that's a great slide, by the way. I feel like a massively trending tweet coming, like hashtag BioITWorld, hashtag Taylor Swift, and then we all get 15 million followers instantly. That would be spectacular, right? Now, at any rate, so the point is, I think you kind of have to create this environment for yourself and not count on interoperability and vendors and the government to deliver this for you. And so this is part of the strategy that we're taking, is to develop a versatile data stack, first of all, where we can actually bring these data sources from lots of different places in, where we can convert the formats and adjust things the way that we need to, and where we can land data in its native formats so that we don't have to spend an inordinate amount of time on upfront ETLs, and also don't have to spend a ton of time trying to coerce data which is fundamentally unstructured or semi-structured into a highly structured environment, like many not only vendor solutions but also many sort of standard organizational relational databases are. So for us, this solution has been to deploy a Hadoop stack. We've we've got a large production level Hadoop cluster running now. We've been able to put more EMR data into that cluster in its first 4 months of existence than we were ever able to extract from our EMR in the past sort of 5 or 6 years that we've been extracting into a relational database. We've also decreased our daily update times by about 80%. So what used to take, 8 hours now takes about an hour and a half. The point is not that everybody should switch to this platform, but the point is you should try to find an environment, whether it's this or some hybrid of big data plus something else or whatever it may be, that is going to allow you to get the data sources in that you need to get in so that you can do the things that you need to do and not make that a rate limiting or highly constraining part of the process. So having technology is a good thing, but it's only part of the picture. You've got to really embrace a system where your people and your management of your tech systems are done in some sort of a more agile fashion. I'm not necessarily, saying it's got to be the textbook agile format or whatever. I use this as an adjective, really. So it's just got to be something where you don't have to worry about a 3-month governance cycle and having 73 people have to sign off on everything and needing 9 committee meetings before you can decide to just throw something out there, right? I mean, what I tell our people is step 1 is make it real, and then step 2 is make it right. And so you've just got to get something out there and iterate over it and build it and work in that direction. That's entirely different than how we often think about things in healthcare. But if we don't bring some of this R&D type mindset into it in some way, shape, or form, it's going to be very difficult to do rapid cycle data-driven innovation. So this is a cool one too. When you start to build those kind of things, I think you also have to think about, okay, what are we really building and what is our audience? And the fact of the matter is that flat reports and static dashboards are pretty much a thing of the past, right? So if you're building something new, you need to get into, I think, a more interactive, more live type environment where you can actually do interesting things with the data, where the intermediary or the middleman between the people who want to get at the data and the people who can present the data, that middleman is eliminated and people can get closer to what they're doing and deal with it in an interactive way. So almost everything that we're building now is some sort of interactive visualization environment, not just a dashboard or not just a report. This is hard to see, but if you go to poly-graph.co, you get this really cool tool that is a interactive data visualization of unique words and language in 35,000 rap lyrics. So this nicely stratifies your active rappers across the spectrum of how many novel lyrics per song they do, so you can see who are the most articulate rappers out there. Not terribly surprisingly, here on the left you have your Drakes and your DMXs, right? Here in the middle you get sort of your middle of the road rappers, your LL Cool J's and your Ludacris and that sort of thing. And then you slide over here and you see a disproportionate representation of like Wu-Tang Clan and that kind of thing. So, but the point is this is really fun even if you're not into rap. Like the first time I found this, I showed it to my wife and she was like clicking around. You can get little bios on people, right? And you can find out information about them. You can sort by East Coast or West Coast rap, and you can even test your Wu-Tang theory by highlighting only members of the Wu-Tang Clan. And in fact, you'll see that they do sort of move to the left. So, the point is it's fun and it makes interacting with your data a task of discovery. My wife didn't even really know who, Bold-Faced Killa was, but now she does, and sees that somewhere it's on this side of it. So you can sort of move in that direction. But the point is, live interactive data visualization is how people want to see their data. And then the last thing is that you can do all of this. So you can have a nice tech stack. You can be developing things fairly quickly. You can put it in a way that is more modern and that people like to work with it. But if you don't build a culture around it and implement some sort of system that facilitates cultural change with your data, you're not going to be terribly successful. So, we've spent a lot of time looking at our own culture about how we use information, how our IT systems are set up, what IT does well and doesn't do well. For us, one of our big cultural changes just over the last few months has been bringing the CIO, the Chief Data Officer, and the CMIO onto a level of parity and thinking about the process not as IT, but thinking about it as a spectrum that is technology, data, and informatics, where technology is the back end that things run on, data is the part in the middle where all the information lives on the back end and moves to the people that need it, and informatics is really the implementation part where we focus on, okay, we've put things together into into a system, now so what? How do clinicians or people who need to use that actually take the tool and put it into the context of an operational system and use it? And by structurally and, more importantly, conceptually putting all those things on the same plane and leveling the playing field, we all sort of move back and forth between all of those sectors. So our CIO can and does have lots of interactions with the people on my teams as the CDO. The CMIO and myself sit in many of the same meetings and talk about how the spectrum of work that we do transitions into the spectrum of work that they're going to do with implementation. So these are all changes that we've really been focusing on and implementing just over the last 6 months or so. So we are early in this journey as well, but it's a lot of cultural change that is backed by technology change, but certainly that's not the one and only part of it, because it's got to be a full spectrum of things. So in my closing slide, I would just summarize by saying there is a tendency to want to do as many things as you can inside the context of your EMR, because you paid millions of dollars for it. It has a bunch of your data, particularly the data that you care about most, and so it seems logical to say, why not put it all in one place? And that makes some sense until you realize that the one place that you're proposing putting it is a place that's designed very well for transactional work and not very well for R&D and innovation and discovery. And so it is not a bad idea to have a system that works in close connection with not only your EMR, but with all the other data sources across your organization. So, the EMR was the first source we loaded onto our new system. By June, we'll have our 7 largest systems, including, our mainframes that do pricing and purchasing, which actually literally are old Siemens mainframes. So, the systems that do quality and safety, variety, our health plan data, we're bringing all these things into the same space, way better than we could before because of the back-end platform. But the point is, it's lots of data coming into one place. The EMR is just one part of that, because what's in the chart is just one part of what you do in healthcare delivery. And so bringing all of that together into a novel space that is really designed for innovation and research and development and delivery of those tools to the patients at the end of it all is an important step, I think, both conceptually and operationally. And then the second part, we went through some general ideas about how to make this work, all the way from the technology side to the cultural side. And I think all of those things are important places to take a look at in your own organizations to figure out how you might be able to implement a system that not just works on paper, not just collects data, but actually flows that information through a system that comes all the way, starting at the technology side, but really going all the way to the point of delivery and focusing ultimately on how clinicians and end users are going to deliver it to improve the quality and the consistency of patient care and clinical experience. So we've got to continue to adapt if we want to innovate, and I think getting outside of the EHR to do a lot of that is an important first step. You can feel free to email me anytime, to find me outside. I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything in this space. Always interested in collaborating, always interested in sharing ideas. So my email is up here, and you can get to me any way you like, and I'm happy to talk to anybody and to take a few questions now if you have any.